15 seconds. That's all it took for Vickie Johnson to disappear from the face of the earth. August 12, 1989, Detroit, Murphy's Diner on Woodward Avenue, 11:47 p.m. Gerald Foster, the night manager, walks 18-year-old Vickie Johnson to her car. It's what he does every Saturday night, his routine, his insistence, his supposed kindness. He watches her wave goodbye, her white sneakers glowing under the parking lot's single functioning streetlight. Her keys jingle in her hand. 30 feet between the diner's back door and her mother's Chevrolet Cavalier. 30 feet of cracked asphalt she's walked 100 times before. Gerald turns back inside to lock up. 15 seconds, maybe less. He pulls the door shut, twists the deadbolt, checks it twice like he always does. The whole motion, 15 seconds, investigators would later confirm. Muscle memory, routine, nothing unusual. When Gerald Foster steps back outside 2 minutes later, heading to his own vehicle, Vickie Johnson is gone. Her Cavalier sits exactly where she parked it, driver's door closed, engine cold, and there, glinting on the asphalt beneath the door handle like scattered stars under that failing streetlight, her keys. Not dropped in panic, not flung during a struggle, just there, resting on the ground as if gravity simply claimed them from her hand mid-motion. No screams, no witnesses, no screeching tires, nothing. A human being doesn't vanish in 30 feet, not on a reasonably trafficked street, not with their manager standing yards away, not in 15 seconds. But Vickie Johnson did. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. Rewind 12 hours. Vickie Johnson woke up that Saturday morning with her whole life stretched out before her like an open highway. 18 years old, fresh graduate from Cass Technical High School with honors. Her acceptance letter to Wayne State University sat in a frame on her bedroom dresser. The words, "We are pleased to offer you admission," practically glowing every time she walked past it. She had one of those laughs that could stop conversations in the best way possible. The kind of laugh that made strangers turn around and smile, even if they had no idea what was funny. At Murphy's Diner, where she worked the evening shift, regulars would literally wait for a table in her section, not because the food was better there, because Vickie made you feel like you mattered. Her manager Gerald said she had a gift for making people feel seen. That Saturday was supposed to be just another shift, one more night of slinging burgers and pie, pocketing tips that she was saving for dorm room essentials, bed sheets, a desk lamp, maybe some posters to make the cinder block walls feel like home. In 2 weeks, she'd be moving into her dorm, starting her real life. Everything she'd worked for, everything her mother, Patricia, had sacrificed for, was about to begin. Her diary entry from August 11th, one day before she vanished, ended with this line. "One more shift and then I'm celebrating with Marcus and the crew. Can't believe summer's almost over. Can't believe my life is actually starting. Everything feels possible." Everything feels possible. 24 hours later, Vickie Johnson's keys would be glinting on asphalt, and every possibility would be ripped away in 15 seconds. Gerald Foster's screams brought the weekend cook sprinting out the back door. Within 20 minutes, Detroit police cruisers flooded Murphy's Diner parking lot, red and blue lights painting the windows in frantic, disorienting colors. Officers secured the scene, radios crackled, flashlights swept every inch of asphalt, every shadowed corner, every dumpster and alley within a 6-block radius. Detective Bernard Kozlowski arrived at 12:30 a.m., his tie already loosened, his eyes already carrying the weight of what he suspected this case would become. He'd worked homicides for 17 years. He knew the difference between a scene that told a story and a scene that screamed something wrong. This was the latter. No signs of struggle, no scuff marks on the pavement, no torn fabric caught on chain-link fencing, no blood spatter, no disturbed gravel in the empty lot adjacent to the diner. The scene was unnervingly clean, too clean for an abduction. Just Vickie's keys lying beneath her car door like some cruel magic trick, her purse still locked inside the Cavalier, untouched, her wallet still folded neatly in the center console with her week's wages, $234 in cash tucked inside. Kozlowski stood there under that failing streetlight, trying to make the geometry work in his head. 30 feet from door to car, Gerald Foster inside for 2 minutes maximum. No witnesses despite Woodward Avenue carrying weekend traffic even at midnight. How does someone disappear in 30 feet? The question would haunt him for the next 30 decades. Here's what keeps people awake at night. Vickie Johnson did everything right. She didn't walk alone. Her manager escorted her. She parked under the only working light in the lot. She had her keys ready, no fumbling in her purse. She waved goodbye. She was 30 feet from safety. And in the time it takes you to lock a door, 15 seconds, she was erased. This wasn't a dark alley. This wasn't a reckless decision. This was a Saturday night, a routine closing shift, a girl walking to her car with someone watching to make sure she got there safely. Except someone else was watching too. Someone who had been planning, someone who knew the lot layout, the timing, the exact moment when no one would see. Someone who understood that the most dangerous place isn't where you expect danger, it's where you feel safe. Patricia Johnson got the phone call at 12:47 a.m. Her daughter's manager, voice shaking, trying to explain the impossible. Vickie left work, walked to her car, and vanished into thin air. This could happen to someone you love in the time you take to lock a door. Subscribe, because awareness is survival. But who was watching Vickie Johnson that night, and why did nobody see the monster standing right in front of them for 15 straight seconds? August 12, 1989, Saturday morning, Detroit. Vickie Johnson opened her eyes at 9:17 a.m. to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. She'd slept in, a luxury she rarely allowed herself during the school year, but summer had its privileges. In just 14 days, she'd be moving into her dorm at Wayne State University. 14 days until everything changed. Her acceptance letter sat in a frame on her bedroom dresser. The words, "We are pleased to offer you admission to Wayne State University, class of 1993. She'd read those words so many times, the paper had started to wear at the creases where she had originally unfolded it, hands shaking back in April. Her mother, Patricia, was already at work, double shift at the hospital, trying to save enough to help with textbooks. Patricia had raised Vickie alone since she was 6, working herself to exhaustion, so her daughter had what she never did: options, education, a future that didn't involve choosing between rent and groceries. Vickie pulled out her diary, a leather-bound journal Patricia had given her for graduation. She clicked her pen and wrote, August 12, 1989. One more shift at Murphy's and then I'm celebrating with Marcus and the crew. Can't believe summer's almost over. Can't believe my life is actually starting. Everything feels possible.
She underlined "everything feels possible" twice. After breakfast, she laid out her work uniform. Black pants, white button-up shirt, the name tag that said Vickie in cheerful red letters. She'd worn that uniform hundreds of times, but tonight felt different. Tonight was one of her last shifts before she stopped being Vickie the waitress and became Vickie the college student. She had no way of knowing she'd never make it to her celebration with Marcus. No way of knowing that in 14 hours, those keys would be glinting on asphalt and her mother would be receiving the worst phone call of her life. Vickie clocked in at Murphy's Diner at 5:03 p.m. The Saturday dinner rush was already building. Families, couples on dates, groups of teenagers pooling their money for burgers and milkshakes. The diner smelled like grease and coffee and something sweet from the pie case, a combination that had become as familiar to Vickie as her own bedroom. "There's my girl," called out Mr. Henderson, a regular who came in every Saturday and always ordered the meatloaf special. He was already seated in her section, menu unopened because he never ordered anything else. "How's my future college professor doing?" Vickie laughed, grabbing her order pad. "Not a professor yet, Mr. Henderson. Give me at least 4 years. You'll be running that place in 2, he said, and he meant it. This was Vickie's gift. She remembered everyone's order, everyone's story. Mrs. Patterson's hip surgery recovery, the Gomez family's son leaving for the Navy, Jake Morrison's new job at the Ford plant. She didn't just take orders, she made people feel like walking into Murphy's Diner meant coming home. The tips piled up throughout her shift. $12 from the Henderson table, $8 from a young couple celebrating their anniversary, $15 from a group of businessmen who'd requested her section specifically after seeing how she handled a difficult customer with grace and humor. Every dollar went into the envelope in her purse, carefully labeled Dorm Fund. She was up to $843, enough for bedding, a desk lamp, some posters, maybe even a small television if she found one at a garage sale. Marcus called during her break at 8:30 p.m. "Still picking you up at midnight?" he asked. "Wouldn't miss it," Vickie said, twirling the phone cord around her finger. "We're celebrating. I'm officially done with high school jobs after tonight." She had no idea Gerald Foster was standing just outside the break room door, listening. Gerald Foster had worked at Murphy's Diner for 11 years, 42 years old, married with 2 young children, church volunteer, neighborhood watch member. The kind of man who held doors open and said please and thank you and never raised his voice. The kind of man everyone trusted. He'd started walking female employees to their cars 2 years earlier after a woman was mugged 3 blocks away. "Just want to make sure you ladies get home safe," he'd said, and everyone thought it was thoughtful, protective, the sign of a good manager who cared about his staff. But if you'd watched closely that night, really watched, you might have noticed small things. The way Gerald positioned himself just slightly too close when talking to Vickie during shift changes. How his hand would rest on her lower back when guiding her past in the narrow kitchen space, lingering a second too long. The comments about her perfume, "Smells nice, Vickie, what is that?" delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Lisa, the weekend hostess, noticed. "Gerald's weird around the young girls," she'd mentioned once to another server. "Not creepy exactly, just, I don't know, intense." But everyone dismissed it. Gerald had a wife, kids. He was just being friendly, just being protective. Besides, Vickie never complained. She was always polite, always professional, always grateful when he offered to walk her out. She didn't notice the way he watched her through the kitchen window when she went to her car during breaks, didn't catch him studying her movements, timing how long it took her to walk from door to vehicle, noting which parking spot she preferred under the working streetlight. Gerald Foster had been planning for weeks, and tonight, with Vickie's last shift before she left for college, he'd decided if he couldn't have her smile, no one would. At 10:30 p.m., the dinner rush finally slowed. Vickie refilled salt shakers and wiped down tables, her feet aching in the white sneakers she'd worn through 2 years of shifts. Just over an hour until closing, just over an hour until she'd clock out for the last time, meet Marcus in the parking lot, and finally celebrate the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had her whole life mapped out. Fall semester, Introduction to Psychology, English Composition, Basic Biology, Basic Algebra. Spring semester, she'd declare her major, maybe social work, maybe teaching. By senior year, internships, job applications, the real world opening up like a door she'd been pushing against her entire life. Have you ever been that close to something you wanted? So close you could almost taste it? Where every hour felt like both forever and not long enough? Where you were terrified and excited and impatient all at once? That's where Vickie Johnson stood at 10:30 p.m. on August 12, 1989. 1 hour and 17 minutes from the end of her shift. 1 hour and 17 minutes from the parking lot. 1 hour and 17 minutes from the 15 seconds that would erase her future completely. Gerald Foster checked his watch and smiled. 11:47 p.m., closing time at Murphy's Diner. Gerald Foster grabbed his keys from the office and met Vickie at the back door, just like he did every Saturday night. It was his ritual, his rule, his non-negotiable policy. No female employee walks to her car alone after closing, not on his watch. "Ready to head out?" he asked, holding the door open. Vickie slung her purse over her shoulder, the envelope of tip money tucked safely inside. "Thanks, Gerald. See you next week." "Oh, wait, actually, I won't. This was my last shift." Gerald's smile didn't waver. "That's right. Off to college. We'll miss you around here." They stepped into the August night, humidity still thick, even at midnight. The parking lot behind Murphy's Diner was small, barely enough space for a dozen vehicles. 3 street lights lined the perimeter, but only one actually worked, casting a weak yellow glow over the employee section, where Vickie's mother's Chevrolet Cavalier sat waiting. 30 feet from the back door to her car. 30 feet of cracked asphalt, a few weeds pushing through the gaps on the chain-link fence separating the lot from the empty commercial property next door. Vickie's white sneakers caught the light as she walked, her keys already in her hand. One of those habits her mother had drilled into her. Always have your keys ready. Don't fumble in your purse. Be prepared. She was prepared. Gerald walked beside her, hands in his pockets, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. When they reached her car, Vickie turned and waved. "Night, Gerald. Thanks for everything." "Drive safe," he said, watching as she approached the driver's side door. Her keys jingled in her hand. She was 3 steps from the car door handle, 3 steps from safety, 3 steps from going home to her mother, meeting Marcus tomorrow, starting her life in 2 weeks. Gerald Foster turned and walked back toward the diner's entrance. 15 seconds later, Vickie Johnson ceased to exist. Gerald Foster pulled the back door shut behind him. The metal frame settled into place with that familiar heavy click, a sound he'd heard thousands of times over 11 years. He twisted the deadbolt, checked it once, checked it twice. Old habit, company policy, muscle memory. He walked through the kitchen, flipping off lights as he went. The fluorescent fixtures buzzed into darkness one by one. He stopped at the manager's office, grabbed his jacket from the hook, glanced at the schedule for Monday's opening shift. 2 minutes. That's what investigators would later confirm. 120 seconds from the moment Gerald locked the back door to the moment he emerged from the front entrance, circling around to the employee parking lot where his own car sat 3 spaces from Vickie's Cavalier. 120 seconds. In that time, a human being can walk approximately 700 feet at normal pace. You can brew a cup of instant coffee. You can tie your shoes, check your voicemail, scan a newspaper headline. 2 minutes is nothing. A commercial break, a traffic light, a sneeze, and a conversation about weather. In 2 minutes, you cannot abduct someone, restrain them, transport them, and disappear without a trace. It's physically impossible. Gerald rounded the corner into the employee lot, keys in his hand, already mentally planning his Sunday. Church in the morning, yard work in the afternoon, maybe take the kids for ice cream if Dorothy felt up to it. That's when he saw Vickie's Cavalier, still parked, engine cold, driver's door closed, and there, on the asphalt, directly below the door handle, catching the anemic glow of that single working street light, her keys, lying flat, perfectly still, like they'd simply slipped from her fingers and fallen straight down. Gerald Foster's scream shattered the midnight silence. "Vickie! Vickie!" The weekend cook, finishing his cigarette by the dumpster, came running. The scene made no sense. Vickie's keys lay on the ground, yes, but the car was untouched. No scratches on the paint, no dents suggesting impact or struggle. The driver's side door was closed, not ajar, not hanging open, closed completely, as if no one had ever reached for the handle. Gerald fumbled with the passenger door, yanking it open. Vickie's purse sat on the seat exactly where she always placed it. He grabbed it, hands shaking, and dumped the contents onto the hood. Wallet, lipstick, a grocery store receipt, her work name tag. And the envelope, the tip money she'd been saving all summer, $234 in small bills, still folded and tucked into the wallet's zipper pocket. No robbery, no theft, no apparent motive. The cook stood frozen, his cigarette burning down to the filter in his hand. What the hell happened? I don't know. Gerald's voice came out strangled. She was right here. I walked her out. She was right here. The parking lot offered nothing. No tire marks streaking across the asphalt. No footprints in the dust collected along the fence line. No broken glass, no torn fabric, no drops of blood. Nothing that screamed violence or struggle or even urgency. Just keys on the ground and the absence of Vickie Johnson. Woodward Avenue ran along the front of the diner, carrying weekend traffic even at midnight. Someone should have seen something, heard something, noticed a girl being forced into a vehicle, a scream, a confrontation, anything. But there was only silence. Gerald ran back inside and dialed 911, his fingers slipping on the rotary dial. Detroit police arrived at 12:09 a.m. 7 cruisers, lights blazing, officers spreading across the parking lot like they could somehow rewind time and catch whoever did this in the act. Gerald Foster stood by the back door, repeating his story to anyone who'd listen. His voice shook, his hands trembled. He kept looking at the spot where he'd last seen Vickie, as if staring hard enough would make her reappear. I walked her out, just like always, he said. She waved goodbye. I went inside to lock up. 2 minutes, maybe less. When I came back out, his voice broke. Her keys were just lying there. Every officer at the scene believed him, every single one. But here's what nobody questioned that night. Something so obvious it hid in plain sight, so simple it seemed impossible. Gerald Foster was the last person to see Vickie Johnson alive, and he was the only person with the opportunity to make her disappear. We'll come back to that. Detective Bernard Kozlowski pulled into Murphy's Diner parking lot at 12:30 a.m., his unmarked sedan cutting through the chaos of flashing police lights and radio chatter. He was 43 years old, 17 years in homicide, and he'd seen enough crime scenes to know the difference between cases that close in 72 hours and cases that never close at all. This one, he knew, within 30 seconds of stepping out of his car, would haunt him. His tie was already loosened, his shirt wrinkled from a double shift that was supposed to have ended 3 hours ago. Saturday nights in Detroit meant bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional armed robbery. Missing persons calls usually meant runaways or custody disputes, people who'd turn up hungover or apologetic by Monday morning. But when the dispatcher said 18-year-old female disappeared from employer parking lot, keys found at scene, Kozlowski's stomach dropped. He approached Gerald Foster first. The manager sat on the curb near the back entrance, head in his hands, 2 officers flanking him taking notes. Gerald looked up when Kozlowski introduced himself, and the detective studied his face the way he learned to study faces, looking for micro-expressions, inconsistencies, the tiny tells that separated genuine trauma from performance. Gerald's eyes were red, his hands shook, his voice kept breaking. Kozlowski filed it away without judgment. Guilty people cry, innocent people cry. Tears meant nothing. Walk me through it, Kozlowski said, pulling out his notebook. Every detail, no matter how small. Gerald recounted the night, the closing routine,
walking Vickie to her car, watching her wave, going inside to lock up, 2 minutes, maybe less, coming back out to find her gone. Did you see anyone else in the lot? No one. Hear anything unusual? Car engines, voices, doors slamming? Nothing. Just nothing. Kozlowski looked at the parking lot, mentally calculating distances and timelines. 30 feet from door to car, 2 minutes inside, no witnesses on a reasonably busy street. He turned to his partner. Get officers canvassing 6 blocks in every direction. I want every business, every resident, every person who was awake within a mile of here. The search for Vickie Johnson had officially begun. Patricia Johnson's phone rang at 12:47 a.m. She'd fallen asleep on the couch waiting for Vickie to come home, something she did every Saturday, telling herself it was just to make sure her daughter got in safely, though really it was because she liked hearing about her shift, the customers, the tips, the small victories of an 18-year-old building her future one table at a time. The voice on the other end belonged to Gerald Foster, and the words didn't make sense. Vickie didn't make it to her car. The police are here. You need to come to the diner. Patricia drove to Murphy's in her nightgown and slippers, not remembering the route, not remembering parking, not remembering anything except the red and blue lights and the police officer who gently took her arm and said, "Mrs. Johnson, we're doing everything we can." By Sunday afternoon, Vickie's disappearance was the lead story on every Detroit news station. Patricia stood in front of microphones and cameras, holding her daughter's senior portrait with both hands because her trembling made it impossible to hold with one. The photo showed Vickie in her graduation cap and gown, the cap sitting slightly crooked, her smile bright enough to light up the frame. "Please," she said, her voice fracturing on the single word. "If anyone knows anything, if anyone saw anything, she's my only child. She's supposed to start college in 2 weeks. Please help me bring her home." The city watched Patricia's hands shake so violently that Police Chief Martin eventually stood beside her, steadying the photograph himself. Detroit responded with the kind of collective heartbreak that only happens when a story hits too close to home. This wasn't some stranger. This was every daughter, every sister, every young woman with dreams and a future. By Monday morning, volunteer search parties had formed. Hundreds of people, strangers, neighbors, Vickie's former classmates, combed through vacant lots, abandoned buildings, alleys, parks, anywhere a girl might be hidden or held. The tips started flooding in within hours. A gas station attendant 2 blocks south of Murphy's Diner remembered seeing a dark-colored van, maybe blue, maybe black, he couldn't be sure, idling near the intersection around 11:50 p.m. But he couldn't recall any license plates, couldn't describe the driver, couldn't even say with certainty whether anyone was inside or if it was just an empty vehicle with engine trouble. Kozlowski sent officers to track down every dark van registered in Wayne County. 347 vehicles matched the vague description. Each one required investigation, interviews, alibis. Each one led to nowhere. A woman 3 blocks east reported hearing a scream around midnight. "Brief and sharp," she told police, "but I didn't think anything of it. Could have been kids fooling around, could have been tires squealing, could have been a cat. You hear all kinds of things living in the city. Could have been Vickie Johnson being dragged into a vehicle. Could have been nothing." Anonymous letters arrived at the police station, each one pointing fingers. Vickie's ex-boyfriend from sophomore year, except he'd moved to California in 1987. A creepy neighbor who watched girls, except he was 74 and wheelchair-bound. A jealous classmate who competed with Vickie for valedictorian, except she'd been at a family wedding in Ohio that entire weekend with 50 witnesses. Psychics called, offering visions. "I see water," one said. "I see a basement," said another. "I see her alive, being held against her will," claimed a third. Police logged every call, followed every lead, wasted precious hours chasing ghosts and con artists. And then there was Marcus Thompson, Vickie's boyfriend, 19 years old, community college student, madly in love with a girl who was supposed to meet him after her shift so they could celebrate the end of summer together. Kozlowski brought him in for questioning on Monday afternoon. Standard procedure. The boyfriend is always a suspect. Marcus walked into the interrogation room and collapsed before he even sat down. Marcus's alibi was airtight. He'd been at his friend David's 19th birthday party across town from 8 p.m. well past midnight. 17 witnesses confirmed it. Photos from the party showed Marcus in the background of multiple shots, time-stamped throughout the evening. Phone records showed he'd called Vickie at her break at 8:30 p.m. from David's house. During questioning, Marcus broke down so completely that 3 detectives had to leave the room. His grief was raw, unfiltered, the kind of anguish you can't fake. He wasn't a suspect, he was a victim too. A kid who'd lost the girl he was planning a future with.
Gerald Foster, meanwhile, underwent 4 separate interviews over the first week of the investigation. Each time, his story remained consistent. Each detail matched. Each timeline held up under scrutiny. His wife, Dorothy Foster, confirmed he'd arrived home around 12:15 a.m. that night, his usual time after Saturday closing shifts. She'd been awake watching television, heard his car pull into the driveway, heard him come through the front door. Their neighbor, Leonard Pruitt, corroborated the timeline. He'd been arriving home from his own night shift at the auto plant and waved to Gerald as they both pulled into their respective driveways around the same time. Maybe 12:10, 12:15, Leonard told police. We exchanged hellos, nothing unusual. Gerald had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. 11 years at Murphy's Diner with 0 complaints. Married, 2 young children, active in his church community, neighborhood watch volunteer. The kind of man who coached Little League and helped elderly neighbors with yard work. Detectives administered a polygraph test. Gerald passed. When asked if he had any involvement in Vickie Johnson's disappearance, the examiner noted no deception indicated. When asked if he knew what happened to Vickie, the machine showed he was telling the truth when he said no. Investigators moved on. Gerald Foster wasn't their guy. Was your instinct the same? Did you believe him? Were you fooled too? 3 weeks, 21 days of searching, 21 days of Patricia Johnson appearing on television with Vickie's photograph, her voice growing quieter each time, hope draining from her eyes like water through cupped hands. 21 days of volunteers combing through Detroit's abandoned buildings, vacant lots, wooded areas, anywhere a girl might be hidden or held or abandoned. 21 days of finding nothing. September 3rd, 1989, Highland Park, Michigan, 4 miles northeast of Murphy's Diner. A construction crew arrived at 6:47 a.m. to break ground on a new warehouse development, one of those urban renewal projects that promised jobs and economic revitalization. The property had sat vacant for years, overgrown with weeds, littered with debris, the kind of forgotten space that exists in every city, invisible until someone decides it's worth something. Tommy Richards, the construction foreman, walked the perimeter doing his standard pre-work safety check. Broken glass, unstable structures, anything that might injure his crew. He was 52 years old, 30 years in construction, and he'd seen his share of trash dumped on vacant properties. Old furniture, broken appliances, bags of garbage people were too cheap to haul to the dump properly. At 7:03 a.m., near the northwest corner of the lot, where the ground sloped slightly downward, Tommy noticed what looked like fabric protruding from disturbed earth. Recent rains, Detroit had been hammered with thunderstorms the past 4 days, had eroded the soil, exposing something that had been buried shallow. Tommy assumed it was discarded clothing, maybe an old tarp someone had used to cover construction materials and abandoned.
He grabbed a shovel and started to clear away the mud. The fabric was a tarp, heavy-duty, industrial grade. Blue, or maybe it had been blue once, hard to tell through the dirt and degradation. Tommy pulled at one corner. The tarp shifted, and he saw what was wrapped inside. His radio call to 911 came through at 7:11 a.m., his voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask him to repeat himself 3 times. Detective Kozlowski's phone rang at 7:23 a.m. He'd been awake for an hour, sitting at his kitchen table with Vickie Johnson's case file spread in front of him, reviewing witness statements for the 100th time, looking for something, anything they'd missed. "We found a body, Highland Park, construction site, young female," his partner said. Kozlowski was in his car within 3 minutes. The scene was chaos by the time he arrived. Cruisers, forensic vans, construction equipment sitting idle, workers clustered in small groups smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. The foreman sat in the back of an ambulance, being treated for shock. The tarp had been carefully excavated by the forensic team, photographed from every angle, documented with the kind of precision that murder investigations demand. Kozlowski stood at the edge of the shallow grave, barely 3 feet deep, hastily dug, the kind of burial that spoke of urgency rather than ceremony. The body inside had been wrapped tightly, positioned in a way that minimized the space needed. Recent rains, Detroit had been hammered with thunderstorms the past 4 days, had eroded the soil, exposing something that had been buried shallow. Tommy assumed it was discarded clothing, maybe an old tarp someone had used to cover construction materials and abandoned. He grabbed a shovel and started to clear away the mud. The fabric was a tarp, heavy-duty, industrial grade. Blue, or maybe it had been blue once, hard to tell through the dirt and degradation. Tommy pulled at one corner. The tarp shifted, and he saw what was wrapped inside. His radio call to 911 came through at 7:11 a.m., his voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask him to repeat himself 3 times. Detective Kozlowski's phone rang at 7:23 a.m. He'd been awake for an hour, sitting at his kitchen table with Vickie Johnson's case file spread in front of him, reviewing witness statements for the 100th time, looking for something, anything they'd missed. "We found a body, Highland Park, construction site, young female," his partner said. Kozlowski was in his car within 3 minutes. The scene was chaos by the time he arrived. Cruisers, forensic vans, construction equipment sitting idle, workers clustered in small groups smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. The foreman sat in the back of an ambulance, being treated for shock. The tarp had been carefully excavated by the forensic team, photographed from every angle, documented with the kind of precision that murder investigations demand. Kozlowski stood at the edge of the shallow grave, barely 3 feet deep, hastily dug, the kind of burial that spoke of urgency rather than ceremony. The body inside had been wrapped tightly, positioned in a way that minimized the space needed. Recent rains, Detroit had been hammered with thunderstorms the past 4 days, had eroded the soil, exposing something that had been buried shallow. Tommy assumed it was discarded clothing, maybe an old tarp someone had used to cover construction materials and abandoned. He grabbed a shovel and started to clear away the mud. The fabric was a tarp, heavy-duty, industrial grade. Blue, or maybe it had been blue once, hard to tell through the dirt and degradation. Tommy pulled at one corner. The tarp shifted, and he saw what was wrapped inside. His radio call to 911 came through at 7:11 a.m., his voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask him to repeat himself 3 times. Detective Kozlowski's phone rang at 7:23 a.m. He'd been awake for an hour, sitting at his kitchen table with Vickie Johnson's case file spread in front of him, reviewing witness statements for the 100th time, looking for something, anything they'd missed. "We found a body, Highland Park, construction site, young female," his partner said. Kozlowski was in his car within 3 minutes. The scene was chaos by the time he arrived. Cruisers, forensic vans, construction equipment sitting idle, workers clustered in small groups smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. The foreman sat in the back of an ambulance, being treated for shock. The tarp had been carefully excavated by the forensic team, photographed from every angle, documented with the kind of precision that murder investigations demand. Kozlowski stood at the edge of the shallow grave, barely 3 feet deep, hastily dug, the kind of burial that spoke of urgency rather than ceremony. The body inside had been wrapped tightly, positioned in a way that minimized the space needed. Recent rains, Detroit had been hammered with thunderstorms the past 4 days, had eroded the soil, exposing something that had been buried shallow. Tommy assumed it was discarded clothing, maybe an old tarp someone had used to cover construction materials and abandoned. He grabbed a shovel and started to clear away the mud. The fabric was a tarp, heavy-duty, industrial grade. Blue, or maybe it had been blue once, hard to tell through the dirt and degradation. Tommy pulled at one corner. The tarp shifted, and he saw what was wrapped inside. His radio call to 911 came through at 7:11 a.m., his voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask him to repeat himself 3 times. Detective Kozlowski's phone rang at 7:23 a.m. He'd been awake for an hour, sitting at his kitchen table with Vickie Johnson's case file spread in front of him, reviewing witness statements for the 100th time, looking for something, anything they'd missed. "We found a body, Highland Park, construction site, young female," his partner said. Kozlowski was in his car within 3 minutes. The scene was chaos by the time he arrived. Cruisers, forensic vans, construction equipment sitting idle, workers clustered in small groups smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. The foreman sat in the back of an ambulance, being treated for shock. The tarp had been carefully excavated by the forensic team, photographed from every angle, documented with the kind of precision that murder investigations demand. Kozlowski stood at the edge of the shallow grave,
barely 3 feet deep, hastily dug, the kind of burial that spoke of urgency rather than ceremony. The body inside had been wrapped tightly, positioned in a way that minimized the space needed. Recent rains had caused the soil to shift and settle, exposing one corner of the tarp. Another week of dry weather, and the construction crew might have paved right over it, sealing Vickie Johnson under concrete for eternity. The medical examiner confirmed identity through dental records by noon. Vickie Johnson, 18 years old, missing for 21 days, dead within hours of her abduction. 4 miles from Murphy's Diner where she'd vanished. 4 miles from where hundreds of volunteers had searched abandoned buildings and wooded areas. 4 miles from where her mother still waited by the phone, clinging to hope that was already 3 weeks cold. The autopsy took place on September 4th, 1989. Dr. Helen Winters, Wayne County's chief medical examiner, had performed thousands of autopsies in her career. She'd seen bodies in every state of decay, every manner of death, every level of violence humans are capable of inflicting on each other. But Vickie Johnson's case made her hands shake. Cause of death: manual strangulation. The hyoid bone in her neck was fractured. Petechohemorrhaging in her eyes, bruising patterns on her throat consistent with someone's hands wrapped around her neck, squeezing until she stopped breathing. Time of death: approximately 2 to 4 a.m. on August 13th, 1989, within hours of her abduction from Murphy's Diner parking lot. Defensive wounds covered her hands, abrasions on her knuckles, broken fingernails, skin torn where she'd clawed at her attacker. Vickie Johnson had fought hard. She hadn't gone quietly into whatever darkness took her. But here's what made Dr. Winters' hands shake, what made seasoned homicide detectives leave the examination room to compose themselves. The killer had washed Vickie's body, methodically, thoroughly, completely. Her skin showed signs of having been scrubbed with something abrasive, possibly industrial soap or detergent. Her hair had been washed, combed through. Every trace of foreign material that might have contained the killer's DNA, skin cells, hair, fibers, bodily fluids, had been eliminated with a level of care that spoke to planning, knowledge, control. Her clothes were missing, never recovered, likely destroyed or disposed of separately. The tarp she'd been wrapped in was generic, available at any hardware store, no distinguishing marks, no manufacturer codes that could be traced. Despite exhaustive forensic analysis using every technology available in 1989, fingerprint powder, chemical reagents, microscopic fiber analysis, blood typing, they recovered nothing. No usable fingerprints, no hair samples that didn't belong to Vickie, no DNA evidence that could identify her killer. Whoever murdered Vickie Johnson had been careful, deliberate, methodical. This wasn't rage. This wasn't impulse. This was execution.
Detective Kozlowski sat in his car outside the medical examiner's office for 2 hours after receiving Dr. Winter's report, trying to process what the evidence was telling him. Random killers don't wash bodies. Crime of passion murderers don't meticulously remove forensic evidence. Opportunistic predators don't plan cleanup procedures before they've even committed the crime. Whoever killed Vickie Johnson knew what they were doing. They understood forensics. They understood police procedure. They understood exactly what evidence needed to be eliminated and how to eliminate it. This person had thought everything through before that night. The location, a vacant property 4 miles away, isolated enough for privacy, but not so remote it would draw suspicion if someone was seen there. The timing, late night, minimal traffic, maximum darkness. The method, manual strangulation, leaves no ballistic evidence, no weapon to trace. The cleanup, destroying every connection between killer and victim. And the most chilling detail, the one that would haunt investigators for 34 years, the one most people still don't know. The killer had possessed Vickie Johnson's body for hours. The medical examiner estimated at least 4 to 6 hours between abduction and burial, based on lividity patterns and environmental factors. 4 to 6 hours of complete control. Time to transport her, kill her, wash her, wrap her, bury her, clean up, and return to normal life before the sun came up. What the killer did next haunted investigators for 34 years. Most people don't know this detail, but it changes everything. Because this level of control, this level of planning, this level of coldness, it doesn't come from nowhere. This wasn't someone's first time thinking about killing. It was just the first time they'd actually done it. September 9th, 1989. Greater Faith Baptist Church on Detroit's East Side. The sanctuary held 300 people comfortably. Over 600 showed up for Vickie Johnson's funeral. They filled every pew, lined the walls, spilled out into the vestibule and onto the front steps. Classmates from Cass Technical High School wore their graduation caps in tribute. Regulars from Murphy's Diner who'd requested her section week after week. Neighbors who'd watched her grow up. Strangers who'd never met Vickie, but couldn't shake the feeling that her story could have been their daughters, their sisters, their friends. The casket sat at the front, closed per Patricia's request. She couldn't bear the thought of people staring at what 3 weeks in the ground had done to her daughter's face. But surrounding the casket, arranged with devastating precision, were the remnants of a future that would never happen. College textbooks, Introduction to Psychology, English Composition 1, Basic Biology, College Algebra, sat stacked on a small table to the left, still wrapped in plastic from the campus bookstore, pages never opened, highlighters never used, notes never taken. To the right, Vickie's acceptance letter from Wayne State University sat framed, the words, "We are pleased to offer you admission," visible to everyone who passed by to pay respects. Her senior portrait rested on an easel beside the casket.
That photo with the slightly crooked graduation cap, the smile that had made strangers feel like family, the eyes that held so much hope they practically glowed through the photograph. Patricia Johnson sat in the front row wearing the same black dress she'd worn to her own mother's funeral 8 years earlier. But she looked nothing like the woman who'd buried her mother. In 3 weeks, Patricia had aged a decade. Her hair, which had been solid brown on August 12th, was now streaked with gray. Her face had hollowed, cheekbones sharp beneath skin that seemed paper thin. Her hands rested in her lap, motionless for once, not from calm, but from exhaustion so complete she had nothing left to shake. The flower arrangements lined the entire front of the church and extended down both side aisles. Carnations and lilies and roses in every color, each one accompanied by a card expressing sorrow, expressing rage, expressing the helpless platitudes people offer when words fail. One arrangement stood taller than the others, an elaborate spray of white roses and blue irises sent by Wayne State University's administration and scholarship committee. The card read, "In memory of Vickie Johnson, class of 1993. We were honored to accept you into our community and devastated that we will never have the privilege of watching you flourish. Your potential was limitless. Your loss is immeasurable." They'd been expecting her on campus in 5 days, her dorm assignment already posted, her class schedule already finalized. Room 347, Henderson Hall. Roommate Jennifer Martinez from Grand Rapids, who would spend the fall semester living alone in a double room, staring at the empty bed where Vickie Johnson should have been unpacking boxes and hanging posters. The funeral service lasted 90 minutes. Pastor Williams spoke about faith and loss and the incomprehensible nature of evil. Vickie's best friend from high school, Amanda Chen, managed to read a tribute through tears, her voice breaking every third word. Marcus Thompson was supposed to speak. He'd written something, 6 pages he'd stayed up all night composing, trying to capture what Vickie meant to him, how she'd had changed his life, how they'd had planned to build a future together. He made it 3 steps toward the podium before his legs gave out. 2 of his friends caught him before he hit the floor and guided him back to his seat, where he sat with his face in his hands, shoulders shaking, making sounds no 19-year-old should ever have to make. No one blamed him. No one expected speeches. No one expected anything except the collective grief of 600 people trying to comprehend how someone so full of life could be so completely gone. The investigation didn't stop after Vickie's funeral. Detective Kozlowski worked the case for another 6 months with the intensity of someone who knew time was running out. He re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, followed up every tip, no matter how far-fetched. But forensic science in 1989 had limits. Without DNA evidence, without witnesses, without any physical connection between victim and killer, the case had nowhere to go. By March 1990, Vickie Johnson's file was moved to active investigation to cold case. Not because anyone stopped caring, not because Kozlowski gave up, but because there was simply nothing left to investigate. He visited Patricia once last before the official reclassification, sitting in her living room with coffee neither of them drank, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "I won't stop looking. This case will never be closed in my mind." Patricia nodded, her eyes dry because she'd run out of tears weeks ago. "I know you won't, but Bernard, I also know how these things work. The person who killed my daughter is walking around free, going to work, coming home to family, living the life Vickie should have lived." She was right. Somewhere in Detroit, Vickie Johnson's killer was living a normal life, maybe eating dinner, maybe tucking children into bed, maybe volunteering at church, or coaching Little League, or helping neighbors with yard work. Living, breathing, free. While Vickie's textbook sat unopened in Patricia's house, collecting dust beside a framed acceptance letter and a photograph of a girl whose smile had been bright enough to light up the darkest spaces. We remember Vickie because her story is everyone's story. Hit that subscribe button. We honor the forgotten together. Some cases go cold, some monsters walk free, but some detectives never stop searching. And 30 years later, Bernard Kozlowski's obsession would finally crack the case wide open. June 15, 1999. Detective Bernard Kozlowski's retirement party filled the precinct conference room with 31 years' worth of colleagues, handshakes, war stories, and a sheet cake that read, "Happy Retirement, Bernie." He was 61 years old. His knees ached. His back protested every time he got out of bed. His doctor had been suggesting retirement for 3 years, concerned about blood pressure and stress levels that wouldn't quit no matter how many medications they tried. His wife Margaret wanted to travel, see the Grand Canyon, visit their daughter in Oregon, spend mornings drinking coffee on the porch instead of hunched over case files at 3 a.m. Kozlowski nodded through the retirement speeches, smiled for the photographs, accepted the engraved plaque thanking him for his service. He cleaned out his desk, packed his personal belongings into a cardboard box, and shook hands with the new generation of detectives who'd be inheriting Detroit's ongoing nightmares. But when he walked out of the precinct that last time, Vickie Johnson's case file walked out with him. Not the official file, that stayed in the archives, buried under 14 years of accumulating cold cases, but Kozlowski's personal file, the 6 notebooks he'd filled over the years with theories, maps, witness re-interviews, timelines, connections that might mean something or might mean nothing. Notebook 1, Initial Investigation, August to December 1989. 247 pages of handwritten notes, sketches of the Murphy's Diner parking lot from every conceivable angle, lists of everyone who'd been questioned. Notebook 2, Follow-up Investigations, 1990 to 1995. Witness re-interviews, new tips, similar cases in Detroit and surrounding areas. Notebooks 3 through 6, The Obsession Years. Maps covered in red circles marking locations of unsolved abductions. Profiles of potential suspects. Timelines reconstructed and reconstructed again. Question marks in the margins that multiplied like cancer cells. Margaret watched him carry those notebooks into his home office and said nothing. She'd been married to this man for 37 years. She knew retirement wouldn't change anything. Vickie Johnson owned a piece of her husband's soul, and the grave hadn't given it back. Every August 12th, without fail, Bernard Kozlowski drove to the corner of Woodward Avenue and Alexandrine Street in Detroit. Murphy's Diner had closed in 1997. The building sold and converted into a cell phone store that eventually became a vape shop that eventually became vacant again. The parking lot where Vickie Johnson vanished remained mostly unchanged. Same cracked asphalt, same chain-link fence, though the single working streetlight had been replaced with modern LED fixtures that actually illuminated the space. Kozlowski would park in the spot where Patricia Johnson's Chevrolet Cavalier had sat that night. He'd turn off his engine, and he'd sit there for hours, watching the parking lot like a film he could rewind and replay if he concentrated hard enough. He knew every measurement by heart. 30 feet from back door to where Vickie's car had been parked. 15 seconds for Gerald Foster to turn around and lock up. 2 minutes until Gerald emerged and found her gone. The math never changed, the impossibility never resolved. In his mind, Kozlowski would walk through it again. Vickie waves goodbye, Gerald goes inside, 15 seconds, someone approaches Vickie, from where? The adjacent empty lot? A vehicle hidden in shadow? How does someone subdue an 18-year-old girl, force her into a vehicle, and drive away in under 2 minutes without anyone hearing screams or seeing headlights? Margaret stopped asking him about these annual trips after the first decade. She'd pack him a thermos of coffee, kiss his cheek, and say nothing when he returned home 6 hours later with that haunted look etched deeper into his face. Meanwhile, 4 miles across town, Patricia Johnson maintained her own ritual. Vickie's bedroom remained exactly as it had been on August 12, 1989. The bed made, the acceptance letter framed on the wall, the diary sitting on the nightstand, open to that final entry. Everything feels possible. Two people trapped in the same August night, unable to move forward, unwilling to let go. Notebook 3 covered the years 1998 through 2005. By then, Kozlowski had exhausted official investigative channels and started operating purely on instinct, pattern recognition, and the kind of obsessive analysis that looks like madness to anyone who isn't living inside it. He'd mapped every unsolved abduction in Detroit from 1985 through 1995, looking for similarities. Young women, evening hours, parking lots or isolated areas, but nothing connected. Different methods, different victimology, different geographical patterns. If Vickie's killer had struck before or since, he'd changed his approach completely. Kozlowski had profiled potential suspects, sex offenders within a 10-mile radius of Murphy's Diner, men with histories of violence against women, anyone who'd been questioned and released during the original investigation. He'd personally re-interviewed 17 people over the years, showing up at their homes or workplaces, asking the same questions in different ways, searching for inconsistencies. Nothing. Page 47 of Notebook 3 was different from every other page. The handwriting was sharper, more urgent, underlined 3 times in red ink. Foster knew the lot schedule. Foster locked up alone. Foster's timeline questionable. Gerald Foster, the manager who'd walked Vickie to her car. Below that, in smaller writing, opportunity, yes, motive, unknown, means, possible. And then, in bullet points, last person to see victim alive, insisted on walking female employees to cars, protective or predatory, perfect knowledge of closing procedures and timing, access to victim's schedule and patterns. But then, taking up the bottom third of the page, heavy black ink crossed out so violently it tore through the paper in places. Alibi confirmed. Wife saw him arrive home 12:15 a.m. Neighbor Leonard Pruitt waved to him in the driveway. Timeline too tight for abduction, transport, murder, and burial. Polygraph passed. No evidence. Wrong suspect. The violence of those crossouts told its own story. Kozlowski had been so close to something, so convinced Gerald Foster was the answer, and then the evidence, the timeline, the witnesses, the polygraph, had shut that door completely. He'd moved on to other theories, other suspects, other dead ends. But for 30 years, one name appeared in those notebooks more than any other, and everyone missed it. Everyone except the detective who couldn't let go. Kozlowski worked 47 homicides during his career. He closed 39 of them, an 83% clearance rate, exceptional by any standard, the kind of record that earned commendations and respect. But the 8 unsolved cases haunted him, 8 families without answers, 8 killers walking free. And yet, Vickie Johnson consumed him in ways the others didn't. Maybe because she'd been so close to escape, 2 weeks from college, from a future that shimmered with possibility. Maybe because the crime scene had been so impossibly clean, suggesting a level of calculation that made his detective's instincts scream. Maybe because Patricia Johnson's face, trembling and hopeful every time he had visited over the years, reminded him that unsolved cases weren't just files, they were mothers who'd never stop waiting for justice. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was because Kozlowski knew, deep in the part of his brain that had solved 39 murders through pattern recognition and instinct, that he'd missed something obvious. The answer was there, somewhere in those 6 notebooks, in those thousands of pages of handwritten analysis, in one of those interviews or timelines or witness statements. He just couldn't see it. By 2015, Kozlowski's health had declined significantly. 2 heart attacks, diabetes. His doctor used words like chronic and management and quality of life. Margaret begged him to stop the annual August 12th pilgrimages, to finally let Vickie rest. He promised he would. He lied. On April 3, 2019, Bernard Kozlowski died of a massive heart attack in his home office, surrounded by maps and photographs and 6 notebooks that represented 30 years of searching. He was 73 years old. His daughter, Jennifer, flew in from Oregon to help Margaret sort through his belongings. When she found the notebooks in his desk drawer, each one labeled Johnson, Vickie, Personal Investigation, she sat on the floor of his office and cried for an hour. Then she called the Detroit Police Department. "My father never stopped working this case. I don't know if any of this matters anymore, but he'd want someone to see it." The next twist will make you question everything you thought you knew. Subscribe so you never miss the truth, because those notebooks were about to speak from beyond the grave. The 6 notebooks arrived at Detroit Police Department's Cold Case Unit on April 19, 2019, 16 days after Bernard Kozlowski's death.
Detective Lisa Carmichael was sitting at her desk working through a 2007 armed robbery turned homicide when her supervisor dropped the package on her desk, a cardboard box marked Personal Effects, Kozlowski, with Jennifer Kozlowski's return address in Oregon. "His daughter sent these," Lieutenant Morris said. "Bernie's personal notes on the Vickie Johnson case, 30 years worth. Thought you might want to take a look." Carmichael had heard stories about Bernard Kozlowski, legendary detective, 83% clearance rate, the kind of investigator younger cops studied and tried to emulate. But he'd retired 6 years before Carmichael joined the force, so she'd never worked with him directly. She opened the box. 6 notebooks, each one labeled with Vickie's name and date ranges. The covers were worn, pages dog-eared, some stained with coffee rings from late nights and obsessive reviewing. Carmichael's first instinct was skepticism. Cold cases required fresh eyes, not 30-year-old theories from a retired detective who'd let a single case consume his entire post-career life. Personal investigations could become echo chambers, seeing patterns where none existed, making connections that satisfied emotional needs rather than evidentiary standards. But something about the weight of those notebooks, the visible deterioration of paper and binding from being opened and reopened thousands of times, made her pause. She flipped open Notebook 1. Kozlowski's handwriting was precise, methodical, the penmanship of someone trained to document evidence for courtroom presentation. The first entry was dated August 13, 1989, written just hours after Vickie Johnson's disappearance. Scene unnaturally clean, no struggle, no witnesses, no physical evidence. Either victim knew attacker or attacker had extensive knowledge of victim's patterns and routines. Focus on close associates and workplace connections. Carmichael settled into her chair and began reading. She didn't leave her desk for the next 7 hours. Detective Carmichael spent 3 months absorbing Bernard Kozlowski's obsession. She read every page, every witness statement, every theory, every map covered in red circles connecting locations that might be significant or might be random. She followed his logic through the initial investigation, through the years of follow-up, through the slow deterioration from structured detective work into something closer to mania. Kozlowski's handwriting changed over the decades. In Notebook 1, his writing was controlled, methodical, the careful documentation of an active investigation. By Notebook 6, covering 2010 through 2019, his handwriting had become erratic, shakier from age, but also more urgent, more desperate, as though time was running out and the answer remained just beyond his grasp. But what struck Carmichael most was the repetition of one name. Gerald Foster appeared in every notebook, sometimes as a witness being re-examined, sometimes as a potential suspect being investigated and dismissed, sometimes as a footnote. Foster's timeline still bothers me, or why was Foster so insistent on walking girls to their cars? Page 47 of Notebook 3 stopped Carmichael cold. 3 lines, underlined in red ink with such force the pen had nearly torn through the page.
Foster knew the lot schedule. Foster locked up alone. Foster's timeline questionable. Below that, a list of observations about Foster's behavior, his access to Vickie, his knowledge of her patterns. And then, consuming the bottom third of the page, violent black crossouts that shredded the paper. Alibi confirmed. Wife saw him arrive home 12:15 a.m. Neighbor Leonard Pruitt waved to him in the driveway. Timeline too tight for abduction plus transport plus murder plus burial. Polygraph passed. No evidence. Wrong suspect. Carmichael stared at those crossouts for 20 minutes. Kozlowski had been convinced Gerald Foster was guilty, absolutely convinced, and then the evidence, the timeline, the witnesses, the polygraph had forced him to abandon that theory. But what if the evidence was wrong? Carmichael requested the original 1989 investigation files from archives, 3 boxes of documents, witness statements, forensic reports, photographs, everything the Detroit Police Department had compiled during those frantic weeks after Vickie's disappearance. Gerald Foster's interviews filled an entire folder. He'd been questioned 4 times in the first week. Each interview showed remarkable consistency. Same timeline, same details, same emotional responses. Shock, grief, guilt that he hadn't somehow prevented what happened. I walked her to her car just like always, he told investigators on August 14th. I watched her wave goodbye. I went inside to lock up. When I came back out, she was gone. If I'd stayed out there 30 more seconds, if I'd just waited until she actually got in her car. His voice had broken during that interview. The detective noted, subject genuinely distraught, hands shaking, had to pause multiple times to compose himself. Gerald's wife, Dorothy Foster, confirmed he'd arrived home around 12:15 a.m., his normal time after Saturday closing shifts. She'd been watching television, heard his car in the driveway, heard him come through the front door. He kissed me goodnight and went to take a shower, she told police. He seemed tired but normal, nothing unusual. Their neighbor, Leonard Pruitt, provided corroboration. He'd been arriving home from his night shift at the auto plant around the same time and waved to Gerald as they both pulled into their driveways. Maybe 12:10, 12:15, Leonard estimated. We said hello. I remember because I was thinking about how we both worked too damn late on Saturdays. The timeline was mathematically impossible. Murphy's Diner closed at midnight. Gerald locked up by 12:02. Even driving aggressively, the commute from the diner to Gerald's house in Dearborn took 18 minutes. That put his arrival home at 12:20 at least. Dorothy and Leonard both said 12:15. Close enough to be believable, specific enough to seem credible. Gerald Foster had passed a polygraph examination on August 22, 1989. The case file noted, no detection indicated, suspect cleared. But Carmichael kept coming back to Kozlowski's violent crossouts. Why had he been so convinced Gerald Foster was guilty, absolutely convinced? And then the evidence, the timeline, the witnesses, the polygraph had forced him to abandon that theory.
Young women in their late teens, evening shifts under Gerald Foster's management. Each one leaving with the same uncomfortable feeling they couldn't quite articulate, couldn't quite prove, couldn't quite report without sounding paranoid. And then there was Brenda Kellerman, the one who tried to report it. Carmichael found Brenda Kellerman living in Ann Arbor, working as an assistant principal at a middle school. 51 years old, married, 2 teenage children, a life built brick by brick over 36 years. The phone call on May 14, 2019 started professionally. Ms. Kellerman, this is Detective Lisa Carmichael with Detroit Police Cold Case Unit. I'm investigating the 1989 murder of Vickie Johnson, and I noticed you filed a workplace complaint at Murphy's Diner in 1987. I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me about your experience there. Silence on the other end. Then, oh my God. Ms. Kellerman? Vickie Johnson. I remember when that happened. It was all over the news. She worked at Murphy's? Yes, ma'am. 2 years after you left. I'm looking into... It was him, wasn't it? Brenda's voice cracked. It was Gerald. Within minutes, Brenda Kellerman was sobbing. Not quiet tears, but the kind of crying that comes from 36 years of carrying something heavy and finally being allowed to set it down. I knew something was wrong with him, she said, words tumbling out between gasps. I knew it, and nobody believed me, and I convinced myself I was overreacting because that's what everyone said I was doing. Tell me what happened, Carmichael said gently. The story poured out. Gerald Foster would volunteer to walk Brenda to her car after closing shifts, but he'd stand too close, his hand resting on her lower back in a way that felt possessive rather than protective. He'd comment on her perfume. "What is that scent? It's nice, suits you," delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd ask questions about her schedule outside work, where she lived, whether she lived alone or with roommates. Always casual, always friendly, always just slightly too interested. One night I forgot something in my car during my break. I went out to get it, and when I bent down to reach into my trunk, I felt like someone was watching. I turned around, and Gerald was standing at the kitchen window, just staring at me. Not doing anything, not moving, just watching, like he was studying me. She quit the next week, told corporate she needed to focus on school, but the watching never left her mind. After Brenda Kellerman's interview, Carmichael went back to the other women with more specific questions. Rachel Thompson remembered Gerald commenting on her hair. He'd touch it sometimes when he walked past me in the kitchen, just run his fingers through it and say something like, "So soft," before moving on. It made my skin crawl, but what was I supposed to report? That my manager touched my hair? Amy Chen recalled Gerald asking detailed questions about her boyfriend, whether we were serious, whether we lived together, whether I was happy. He framed it as concern. "I want to make sure my girls are being treated right." But it felt invasive, like he was checking whether anyone would miss me if something happened. Lisa Washington, the earliest employee Carmichael tracked down, had the most chilling memory. He kept a clipboard with all the closing shift schedules, but I caught him adding notes to it once, little annotations next to names, what time we usually left, which days we worked, whether we carpooled or drove alone. He said it was for security purposes, making sure everyone got home safe. Now I wonder what he was really tracking. The pattern was undeniable. Gerald Foster had spent years targeting young female employees under his management. The protective behavior, walking employees to their cars, asking about their safety, showing concern for their well-being, wasn't kindness, it was access, it was reconnaissance. It was a predator studying his prey while everyone applauded him for being such a caring manager. In 2019, Gerald Foster was 67 years old, long retired from Murphy's Diner. His wife Dorothy had died in 2015 from cancer. His 2 children, now adults in their 30s, had moved away years ago, one to Arizona, one to Florida. Limited contact with their father, according to social media profiles Carmichael reviewed. Gerald lived alone in the same Dearborn house he'd lived in during 1989. He volunteered at his church. He attended neighborhood watch meetings. He helped elderly neighbors with yard work. The perfect picture of a harmless old man living a quiet retirement. A monster hiding behind normalcy for 34 years. By June 2019, Detective Carmichael had built a compelling profile of Gerald Foster as a predator who targeted young female employees for years. Multiple women with consistent stories spanning from 1986 through 1989, a pattern of behavior that escalated from inappropriate comments to physical boundary violations to active surveillance. And then Vickie Johnson, the girl who smiled at everyone, the girl who was about to escape to college, the girl who would have been completely out of Gerald's reach in 2 weeks, disappeared and died under his watch. The circumstantial case was strong. The behavioral profile was damning.
But circumstantial cases don't hold up in court without physical evidence. Carmichael had no forensic evidence linking Gerald Foster to Vickie Johnson's murder. The 1989 investigation had recovered nothing from the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers that could be traced back to him. The body had been washed clean. The clothes had never been recovered. And Gerald's alibi from August 12, 1989 remained intact. Dorothy Foster had confirmed he arrived home at 12:15 a.m. Their neighbor, Leonard Pruitt, had waved to him in the driveway at the same time. Dorothy was dead, couldn't be re-questioned, couldn't be pressured to reconsider her alibi statement, or admit if she'd been asleep and assumed Gerald had come home when he'd actually arrived hours later. But Leonard Pruitt was still alive. Have you ever ignored a gut feeling about someone? Dismissed your instinct because you couldn't explain it, couldn't prove it, couldn't articulate why someone made you uncomfortable? Those women at Murphy's Diner knew something was wrong with Gerald Foster. Their bodies knew it before their minds could rationalize it. But they had no evidence, no proof, nothing concrete enough to report without being dismissed as dramatic or oversensitive. Instinct can save lives, but instinct alone doesn't convict killers. Carmichael sat at her desk in late June 2019, surrounded by witness statements from women who'd quit their jobs 30 years ago because of an uncomfortable feeling. She had a behavioral pattern, she had witness testimony from multiple women, she had strong circumstantial evidence that Gerald Foster was a predator who targeted young female employees for years. But she had no physical evidence, no confession, no witnesses to the actual crime. She needed something concrete, something that would crack the alibi or connect Gerald to the murder scene. She needed the kind of breakthrough that comes from technology that didn't exist in 1989. Until she found it in the one place no one had thought to look again. A single fiber on a deteriorating tarp, dismissed 30 years ago as environmental contamination, waiting for forensic science to finally catch up. Detective Carmichael's investigation stalled through late 2019 and into 2020. She had a behavioral pattern, she had witness testimony from multiple women. She had strong circumstantial evidence that Gerald Foster was a predator who targeted young female employees for years. But she had nothing that would stand up in court, nothing that connected him directly to Vickie Johnson's murder. And without Dorothy Foster alive to reconsider her alibi statement, without physical evidence, without a confession, the case remained exactly where it had been for 30 years. Solved in theory, unprovable in practice. Carmichael refused to let it die again. While she waited, forensic science continued its revolution. The techniques that had seemed like science fiction in 1989 were becoming standard procedure by 2023. Touch DNA analysis, extracting genetic material from skin cells left behind by simple contact, had advanced to the point where analysts could pull profiles from items that would have yielded nothing a decade earlier. Genealogical databases exploded. Millions of people uploading their DNA to ancestry websites, innocently searching for relatives and ethnic heritage, unknowingly creating the largest criminal investigation tool in history. The Golden State Killer had been caught this way in 2018. Dozens of cold cases were being cracked through familial DNA matching. In early 2023, Carmichael made a decision. She petitioned the department to allocate funds for a complete re-examination of every piece of physical evidence collected in 1989, using modern forensic techniques. Most of it will be degraded, the lab supervisor warned her. 34 years in storage, some of it not even climate-controlled for the first decade. Don't get your hopes up. Just test everything, Carmichael said. Everything.
The evidence boxes arrived at the forensic lab in March 2023. Among the items, the blue tarp that had wrapped Vickie Johnson's body, stored in a sealed evidence bag since September 1989. And on that tarp, cataloged and dismissed 34 years earlier, a single fabric fiber labeled environmental contamination, likely from storage or transport. Nobody had tested it in 1989. There'd been no reason to. It was contamination, not evidence. Until now. The forensic analysis took 11 weeks. Modern touch DNA extraction techniques allow analysts to recover genetic material from the oils and skin cells left behind when someone handles an object. The fiber on the tarp, barely visible without magnification, dismissed as irrelevant for 3 decades, was subjected to processes that didn't exist when Vickie Johnson was murdered. The lab used a technique called differential extraction to separate any human DNA from environmental contamination. They amplified the genetic material through multiple rounds of PCR, polymerase chain reaction, creating enough copies to analyze. Week after week, Carmichael called for updates. Week after week, the lab supervisor said the same thing. Still processing, be patient. On June 19, 2023, the call she'd been waiting for finally came. "We got a partial profile," the supervisor said. "Not a full profile. There's degradation in limited material, but we extracted enough markers to run it through databases." "How partial?" Carmichael asked, heart racing. 13 markers, enough to establish a statistical match if we find a suspect. We ran it through CODIS first, no direct hits. Whoever left this DNA hasn't been arrested for a crime requiring DNA submission. Carmichael felt the familiar disappointment. No direct match meant no immediate suspect. "But," the supervisor continued, "we can try genealogical databases. Same technique they used for the Golden State Killer. We upload the profile to public ancestry databases and look for familial matches, people who share enough genetic markers to be related to our unknown subject." It was a long shot. It required the killer to have relatives who'd voluntarily submitted their DNA to ancestry websites. It required those relatives to be close enough, cousins, siblings, aunts, uncles, for the genetic connection to show up in database algorithms. But it was the only shot they had. The lab uploaded the partial DNA profile to 3 major genealogical databases: GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and Ancestry. And then they waited. For 6 weeks, nothing. The databases processed millions of genetic profiles, searching for matches, finding nothing close enough to narrow down. On August 3, 2023, 34 years and 1 week after Vickie Johnson's murder, the algorithm pinged a match. Familial DNA, shared markers indicating a close relative. The profile belonged to someone named Robert Foster, living in Ohio, age 63. Gerald Foster's first cousin. Robert Foster had submitted his DNA to Ancestry.com in 2019, curious about his family's genealogical history. He'd wanted to trace his roots, maybe find distant relatives, understand his ethnic background. Standard reasons millions of people use these services. He had no idea his genetic profile would help solve his cousin's murder. The forensic genealogist worked backward from Robert Foster's profile, building a family tree through public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data. The process took weeks, meticulous construction of family connections spanning generations. Gerald Foster appeared in that tree, born 1957, son of Thomas and Margaret Foster, first cousin to Robert through their father's side of the family. The genetic markers from the tarp fiber matched the genetic profile expected from someone in Gerald Foster's immediate family with a statistical probability that made Carmichael's hands shake when she read the report. But probability isn't certainty. Familial DNA matching could narrow suspects to a family group, but it couldn't definitively identify one individual. They needed Gerald Foster's actual DNA to confirm the match. On March 7, 2024, Detective Carmichael walked into judge's chambers with a 47-page petition for a search warrant authorizing the collection of Gerald Foster's DNA. She laid out the behavioral pattern, the witness statements, the familial DNA match, the 34 years of circumstantial evidence pointing to one man. The judge signed the warrant at 3:22 p.m. Carmichael couldn't arrest Gerald Foster yet, not without confirmation that his DNA matched the fiber, but she could collect his DNA through lawful means and compare it to the evidence. On March 14, 2024, two plainclothes officers followed Gerald Foster to a grocery store in Dearborn. They watched him buy orange juice, bread, and coffee. They watched him drink that coffee in his car before driving away. After he left, they retrieved the discarded cup from the trash can outside the store's entrance. The lab processed the sample within a week. On April 2, 2024, the results came back. Statistical match probability 99.97%. The DNA on the tarp that had wrapped Vickie Johnson's body belonged to Gerald Foster. 34 years, 8 months, and 21 days after Vickie Johnson's murder, they finally had proof. While Carmichael prepared the arrest warrant, she pulled up a map of Detroit and its surrounding suburbs. Murphy's Diner, where Vickie Johnson had worked and vanished, 4217 Woodward Avenue. Patricia Johnson's home, where Vickie had lived and where her mother still waited, 1847 Edison Street. Gerald Foster's home in Dearborn, where he'd lived since 1982, 3309 Cambridge Drive. The distance between Patricia's house and Gerald Foster's house, 4.2 miles. For 34 years, Vickie Johnson's killer had lived 4 miles from her mother's home. Same city, same metro area, same community. Gerald Foster had driven past Patricia's street hundreds of times. He'd shopped at the same grocery stores, pumped gas at the same stations, maybe even stood behind her in line at the pharmacy, two strangers whose lives were connected by the most horrific violence, and neither one knowing it. Patricia Johnson had spent 34 years waiting for justice, sleeping in a house 4 miles from the man who strangled her daughter and buried her in a shallow grave. Gerald Foster had spent 34 years volunteering at church, helping neighbors with yard work, attending community events, living the life of a harmless retiree, 4 miles from the woman whose life he destroyed. Evil had been hiding in plain sight, not in shadows, not in some distant city, right there, 4 miles away. Evil doesn't announce itself with warning signs and suspicious behavior. It doesn't wear a mask or lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes evil drives a sedan, volunteers at church, helps elderly neighbors with groceries, and waves hello at community meetings. Sometimes evil lives 4 miles from its victim's grieving mother and sleeps soundly every night for 34 years. Evil hides in plain sight. Subscribe and stay informed. You never know who's next door. On April 15, 2024, Detective Lisa Carmichael drove to 3309 Cambridge Drive in Dearborn to arrest a man who'd been free for 34 years, 8 months, and 21 days. Justice was finally coming to Gerald Foster's door. April 15, 2024, 7:43 a.m. 34 years, 8 months, and 21 days after Vickie Johnson's murder, Detective Lisa Carmichael stood on the front porch of 3309 Cambridge Drive in Dearborn, flanked by 4 uniformed officers and 2 detectives from the Fugitive Apprehension Unit. The house was modest, well-maintained lawn, American flag hanging from the porch, a bird feeder in the front yard. The kind of house that screamed normal, unremarkable, safe. Carmichael knocked. Footsteps inside, slow, measured, the shuffling gait of an elderly man taking his time. The door opened. Gerald Foster stood in the doorway wearing a gray cardigan over a button-up shirt, glassing pieces perched on his nose, white hair neatly combed. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked like the kind of man who'd help you carry groceries or offer directions if you were lost. He looked at Carmichael, then at the officers behind her, then back to Carmichael. And he nodded. Just slightly. the kind of nod you give when something you've been expecting finally arrives. No shock, no confusion, no "what's this about?" or "there must be a mistake." Just, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." Gerald Foster said, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." Not, "I didn't do it." Not, "This is ridiculous." Not, "I want my lawyer." Just, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." They cuffed him gently. He was 67, frail-looking, offering no resistance. He walked to the patrol car with his head up, back straight, like a man going to an appointment he'd marked on his calendar decades ago. The ride to the station took 23 minutes. Gerald Foster didn't say a single word. The interrogation began at 9:17 a.m. in Interview Room C at Detroit Police Headquarters. Gerald Foster sat across from Detective Carmichael and Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen. His attorney, a public defender named Richard Marshall, sat beside him, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the hours wore on.
Marshall advised his client multiple times, "Don't say anything. Let me handle this." But Gerald Foster had been silent for 34 years. Now he wanted to talk. Not confessing exactly, not the tearful breakdown of someone racked with guilt. Gerald spoke in a monotone, clinical voice, as if he were recounting someone else's actions from a great distance, as if he were reading a technical manual rather than describing murder. "I'd been planning it for weeks," he said, staring at a spot on the wall above Carmichael's head. "Vickie reminded me of someone, a girl I knew in high school, Lisa Ann Brennan. She was kind to everyone, smiled at everyone, made everyone feel special. I thought she felt something for me specifically, but she didn't. She was just nice. When she started dating someone else, I realized I'd misread everything." He paused. No emotion, just factual recitation. "When Vickie started working at Murphy's, she had that same quality, that same smile. I watched her make everyone feel seen, feel valued, and I started thinking about what it would be like if that smile was only for me, if I could own it completely." Carmichael felt nausea rising in her throat, but kept her expression neutral. "Tell me about August 12, 1989. Gerald's eyes refocused, landing on her face for the first time. "I'd borrowed my brother-in-law's van 2 days earlier, told him I needed to move some furniture for a friend. He didn't ask questions. I prepared everything: chloroform, plastic tarp, gloves, cleaning supplies. I knew exactly how I'd do it." "You planned to kill her." "I planned to take her," Gerald corrected, as if the distinction mattered. "The killing, that was a response to circumstance. She fought more than I expected. She was stronger than she looked. When she started screaming through the chloroform-soaked cloth, I had to make a choice." His voice remained flat, emotionless, like he was describing a decision about what to have for dinner. "I chose to eliminate the problem." Richard Marshall put his head in his hands. Gerald Foster kept talking. For 7 hours, he laid out every detail of Vickie Johnson's final night with the precision of someone describing a completed project. "I walked her to her car just like I always did. She waved goodbye. She thanked me. She turned toward her car, keys in her hand. I went back inside and locked the door." "But you didn't stay inside," Carmichael said. "No, I went out the front entrance, circled around through the alley behind the diner. The van was parked 1 block over on a side street. I'd positioned it there earlier in my shift. I waited in the shadows near the chain-link fence. I could see her approaching her car." His breathing didn't change. His heart rate, monitored by the equipment in the interview room, remained steady. "I waited until she bent down slightly to unlock the door. Then I came up behind her.
The chloroform cloth went over her nose and mouth. She tried to scream, but the chemical suppressed it. She struggled. God, she struggled hard. But I had size and surprise on my side. 15 seconds, maybe 20, and she stopped fighting. I dragged her to the fence line, through a gap I'd noticed weeks earlier, into the empty lot next door. From there, 50 feet to where the van was parked. The entire abduction took less than a minute, Carmichael said, her voice tight. 47 seconds from initial contact to having her in the van, Gerald confirmed. I'd timed it during my planning. I knew exactly how long I had before someone might notice. He described driving to Highland Park, to a vacant property his uncle had owned and abandoned years earlier, a place Gerald had explored in his 20s, a place he knew no one visited. He described strangling Vickie when the chloroform wore off and she started screaming. He described washing her body with industrial cleaner. He described wrapping her in the tarp and burying her in a grave he dug the previous weekend. By 3 a.m., it was over, he said, his tone suggesting relief at completing a difficult task. He returned the van to his brother-in-law's driveway, cleaned it thoroughly, and drove home. I arrived at 4 a.m. But your wife said you arrived at 12:15, pressed Carmichael. Dorothy was asleep. She went to bed about 11 p.m. most nights. When I came home, I made noise in the hallway, flushed the toilet, ran water in the sink. In the morning, she assumed I came home at my usual time. I never corrected her. And the neighbor who saw you? Gerald smiled for the first time. Leonard Pruitt waved to me the Saturday before, August 5th, same time, similar circumstances. When police asked him about August 12th, he conflated the two nights. I never corrected that either.
The trial began on October 7, 2024, in Wayne County Circuit Court. National media descended on Detroit. Court TV broadcast live coverage. True crime podcasters lined up for public seating. This was the story that had everything. A decades-old cold case, DNA evidence, a confession, and a victim whose story had haunted a generation. But for Patricia Johnson, now 76 years old and moving with the aid of a walker, the trial wasn't a story. It was the final chapter of her daughter's life, the chapter she'd been waiting 35 years to read. She sat in the front row every single day, arriving early, staying until the bailiff announced adjournment. Her face had become a fixture in the courtroom, weathered, exhausted, but present, always present. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence. DNA analysts explained how genetic material on the tarp matched Gerald Foster with 99.97% certainty. Forensic genealogists described how familial DNA matching had identified him. Detectives detailed the investigation that finally connected decades-old suspicions to modern proof. Then came the witnesses from Murphy's Diner. Brenda Kellerman, Rachel Thompson, Amy Chen, Lisa Washington, women now in their 50s testifying about a man who'd made them uncomfortable 3 decades ago. Their voices shook, their hands trembled, but their stories were consistent, damning, a pattern of predatory behavior that painted Gerald Foster as exactly what he was. Gerald sat through it all with no visible reaction. His attorney mounted a defense based on the unreliability of touch DNA and the circumstantial nature of behavioral testimony, but it was a motion made for the record, not for victory. Everyone in that courtroom knew the outcome before the jury retired to deliberate.
On November 18, 2024, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. We, the jury, find the defendant Gerald Foster guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for their phones. Spectators gasped and cried and hugged each other. Patricia Johnson sat completely still. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet for anyone else to hear.
I can sleep now. Sentencing came on December 3, 2024. Life without the possibility of parole. As bailiffs prepared to lead Gerald Foster from the courtroom for the final time, a reporter shouted a question. Why? Why Vickie Johnson? Gerald Foster paused, turned slightly, and spoke his last public words. She smiled at everyone the same way she smiled at me. I wanted that smile to be only mine. Possessive obsession or pure evil? The comments will decide. December 3, 2024. Gerald Foster was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 35 years, 3 months, and 21 days after he murdered Vickie Johnson. The case was officially closed on December 10, 2024. All documentation filed, all evidence cataloged and archived. The file that had lived in active status, then cold case status, then active again, was finally marked closed, solved. That afternoon, Detective Lisa Carmichael drove to Woodlawn Cemetery on the outskirts of Detroit. She found Bernard Kozlowski's grave in section 14, row 7. A simple headstone. Bernard Joseph Kozlowski, 1946 to 2019. Beloved husband, father, detective. He never stopped searching. Carmichael stood there for a long time, holding a folder containing the case closure documents. The wind cut through the cemetery, rustling the few remaining leaves on nearby trees. She placed the folder on his headstone, weighing it down with a small stone so it wouldn't blow away. "You were always right about Foster," she said quietly. "All those years, all those notebooks, all those nights you couldn't sleep, you knew. Your instinct was screaming at you, and the evidence made you doubt yourself, but you were right." She thought about the 6 notebooks, the deteriorating handwriting, the violent crossouts on page 47 of Notebook 3. A man who'd spent 14 years of retirement consumed by a case everyone else had forgotten. "I hope you can rest now," Carmichael added. "Vickie has justice, Patricia has closure, and you were vindicated. The detective work was brilliant. The instinct was perfect. You just didn't have the technology to prove it." A few visitors walked past in the distance, carrying flowers to other graves. The sun was setting, painting the cemetery in gold and shadow. Carmichael saluted the headstone, a gesture of respect from one detective to another, and walked back to her car. Justice had taken 35 years, but it had finally arrived. In early January 2025, Patricia Johnson made a decision she'd been avoiding for 36 years. It was time to dismantle Vickie's bedroom. The room had remained frozen since August 12, 1989. The bed made with the same sheets, the acceptance letter framed on the wall, the diary on the nightstand, open to that final entry. Everything feels possible. The college textbook stacked in the corner, still wrapped in plastic. For 36 years, Patricia had kept the room as a shrine, not morbid but hopeful, a space where Vickie's future still existed, where 18-year-old dreams were still alive and possible. But with Gerald Foster in prison, with the case finally closed, Patricia realized she'd been waiting for permission to let go. Not to forget, she would never forget, but to stop living in August 1989. She donated the textbooks to Wayne State University, where they became part of a memorial scholarship established in Vickie's name, the Vickie Johnson Memorial Scholarship for first-generation college students. Since its creation in 2025, it had helped dozens, eventually hundreds of young people, kids who reminded administrators of Vickie, kids with big dreams and limited resources, attend the university that Vickie never got to experience. Her acceptance letter, though, didn't go to the university archives. Patricia had it reframed and hung it in her living room above the couch she'd fallen asleep waiting for Vickie that last night. Not as a shrine, but as a reminder that promise doesn't die just because a person does. A reminder that Vickie's potential, though stolen, was real, tangible, documented in an official letter from a university that wanted her. Patricia was 76 years old. She'd spent more of her life grieving Vickie than raising her, but for the first time in 36 years, she could sleep through the night without nightmares. Justice hadn't brought Vickie back. Nothing could, but it had finally allowed her to stop waiting. The Vickie Johnson Memorial Scholarship recipient for the 2025-2026 academic year was an 18-year-old named Jasmine Carter from Detroit's East Side, first-generation college student, graduated with honors, accepted to Wayne State with dreams of becoming a social worker. When Jasmine received the scholarship notification, it came with Vickie's story. Not just the murder, anyone could Google that, but who Vickie had been. The laugh that cut through chaos, the smile that made strangers feel like family. The girl who'd saved every tip because she believed in her future so fiercely she could taste it. Jasmine read the story and cried. Then she walked into her first day of classes, carrying Vickie's memory with her. That's what evil can't kill. Gerald Foster stole Vickie's life. He stole 35 years of birthdays and graduations and career accomplishments and relationships and joy. He stole grandchildren Patricia would never meet. He stole the social worker or teacher or psychologist Vickie might have become. But he couldn't steal the meaning. Vickie's story exposed a predator who might have hurt others. It validated the instincts of women who'd known something was wrong but couldn't prove it. It demonstrated that cold cases can be solved, that justice can arrive even after decades, that the right detective asking the right questions can crack even the most impossible case. And it created a scholarship that would help dozens, eventually hundreds of first-generation college students achieve the dreams Vickie never got to pursue. Evil can steal moments, it can steal lives, it can steal futures, but it cannot steal meaning. It cannot erase impact. It cannot dim a smile that made everyone feel seen, even 36 years after that smile was silenced. Vickie's light continued to illuminate the darkness, not despite the horror of her death, but because people refused to let that horror be the end of her story. This case teaches us something we'd rather not learn. Evil doesn't look like we expect it to. It doesn't announce itself with warning signs and criminal records. Sometimes evil coaches Little League. Sometimes it volunteers at church. Sometimes it waves hello to neighbors and helps elderly people with groceries.
Sometimes evil is the manager who insists on walking you to your car for your safety. The women who worked at Murphy's Diner knew something was wrong with Gerald Foster. They felt it in their bones, in their gut, in that primal part of the brain that recognizes predators even when we can't articulate why. But they had no proof, no evidence, just a feeling. And feelings in 1989 didn't count for much. Bernard Kozlowski knew Gerald Foster was guilty. He felt it so strongly he kept investigating for 14 years after retirement, filling 6 notebooks with theories and maps and timelines. But the evidence made him doubt his instinct, made him cross out his suspicions in violent black ink. Lisa Carmichael trusted both the women's instincts and Kozlowski's obsession. She asked the questions no one had asked. She requested the records no one had reviewed. She looked at patterns instead of individual incidents. And she proved that truth doesn't have an expiration date. Justice delayed is still justice. Cold cases can be solved. Technology advances. Evidence speaks when given new tools to translate its language. If this story moved you, honor Vickie by sharing it. Subscribe, because these stories deserve to be told. If you're not subscribing yet, comment why. What's holding you back? Let's talk. Vickie Johnson was supposed to start at Wayne State University on August 28, 1989. She was supposed to move into room 347, Henderson Hall. She was supposed to become a social worker or a teacher or whatever she chose to become, because with a smile like hers and a heart like hers, she would have succeeded at anything. Her dream never made it to Wayne State.
But her legacy, that graduated with honors.